Captain Abigail Harper. The voice on the phone was trembling. I was standing in my kitchen at 11:43 on a humid South Carolina night, still half unpacking from my honeymoon, when the man on the other end lowered his voice and said words that froze the blood in my veins. Abigail, I discovered something terrible. Come to my office immediately, and whatever you do, don't tell your father. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Then he added 5 words that changed my life forever. It's about your father's DNA. Aline. 30 minutes later, I was driving through downtown Charleston, in full Marine Corps service uniform, my hands locked tight around the steering wheel. Even now, looking back, I can still feel the weight of that drive. The city was quiet, washed in yellow streetlight and summer heat. The harbor breeze carried the smell of salt through my cracked window. Most people were asleep in their tidy homes with porch lights glowing soft against old brick and magnolia trees. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. I remember envying them. At 28, I thought my life was settled, predictable. I'd done everything right. Graduated college with honors. Commissioned into the United States Marine Corps. Earned my captain's bars after 6 hard years of service. Married Daniel, a steady, thoughtful Navy lieutenant who never raised his voice and always made the coffee before I woke. And through it all, my father had stood there like an immovable stone. Richard Harper. Tall, controlled, emotionally reserved. A Charleston businessman who believed discipline was the highest virtue and affection was best left unspoken. He wasn't cruel. Not exactly. But love from Richard Harper came wrapped in expectation. He paid for my education. He attended every promotion ceremony. He shook Daniel's hand at our wedding and said, "Don't disappoint her." But he never hugged me. Not once after childhood. And every time I wore my dress blues, he looked at me with something close to contempt. 2 months earlier, when I stood before family and friends at my promotion ceremony, he leaned close and muttered, "Playing soldier doesn't make you important, Abby." I smiled through it, like always, because he was my father. And because children, even grown ones in uniform, spend their lives trying to earn approval that may never come. St. Joseph Medical Center stood quiet under the moonlight when I arrived. Dr. Michael Carter was waiting at the side entrance. He looked pale, too pale. His gray hair was damp against his forehead, and his usual calm physician's smile was nowhere to be found. "Captain Harper." "What happened?" I asked. He glanced over his shoulder before speaking. "Come with me." He led me down a private corridor toward his office. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere distant, a monitor beeped steadily. Hospital sounds. Familiar sounds. My father had been here all week preparing for kidney transplant evaluation. His health had been declining for nearly a year, though he'd fought the diagnosis with his usual stubborn silence. Dr. Carter closed the office door behind us and locked it. That was the moment I knew this wasn't about medicine. He crossed to his desk and picked up a sealed folder. Then he looked me straight in the eye. "Captain, before I show you this, I need your word. You won't confront your father until you've seen everything." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. "What is this?" He hesitated. Then he slid the file across the desk. "During transplant screening, we ran compatibility DNA analysis." I frowned. "That's standard." "Yes." He swallowed hard. "But your father's results raised an anomaly." I opened the folder. At first, the pages looked like meaningless medical data. Then I saw the highlighted line. Paternity excluded 99.99%. The room tilted. I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, because my mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. "This is wrong." Dr. Carter said nothing. I looked again. The numbers didn't change. "No," I whispered. "No, this is some clerical mistake." He sat slowly across from me. "Abigail, I reran the test 3 times myself." I stared at him. The silence stretched. Then he reached into his desk drawer and removed a second folder. This one older, yellowed at the edges. He placed it gently beside the first. 28 years ago, he said quietly, a paternity analysis was performed at this hospital under sealed authorization. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat. By who? He looked ashamed. Your father paid to have the results buried. For several seconds I couldn't move. Couldn't blink. Couldn't think. Then with shaking hands I opened the second file. Inside was another DNA report. Older formatting. Official seals. And one line typed cleanly across the page. Biological father match confirmed. Beneath it was a name I knew as well as my own. A name every Marine in America knew. General Nathaniel Reeves, United States Marine Corps. The folder slipped from my hands and struck the floor. I couldn't breathe. General Reeves, America's most decorated living Marine. The man whose portrait hung in command buildings across the country. The man who had pinned my captain's bars on my collar 6 months earlier at Camp Lejeune. The man who had paused afterward, looked into my eyes, and said something I'd never understood. Your mother would have been proud. At the time, I thought it was formal kindness. A polite military blessing. Now those words hit me like artillery fire. Dr. Carter's voice sounded far away. There's more. I looked up slowly. He slid a photograph across the desk. A young woman in marine dress blues smiled beside a younger Nathaniel Reeves. Her hand rested gently against her stomach. My stomach. My knees buckled, because the woman smiling at the camera was my mother. And written on the back, in faded blue ink, were 5 words that shattered what remained of my world. Waiting for Abigail to arrive. I sank into the chair, unable to speak, unable to think, unable to understand how the man I called father had stolen 28 years of truth. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief and shock and disbelief, something colder began to rise. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter. Something far more dangerous. The need to know why. And once I knew, what I would do with the truth. I did not sleep that night. I drove home just before dawn, parked in the driveway of the Charleston house where I had grown up, and sat behind the wheel staring at the dark windows as if I were looking at a stranger's home. Inside, Daniel was still asleep. Inside, the life I thought I understood was still waiting for me. And somewhere upstairs, folded neatly in a cedar chest I had not opened in 15 years, I suddenly knew there had to be answers. When I finally stepped through the front door, Daniel was already standing in the kitchen. He had that Navy habit of waking instantly alert no matter the hour. His dark hair was rumpled and his expression tightened the moment he saw my face. Abby. I couldn't speak. I simply handed him the file. He read the first page, then the second. Then he looked up slowly and I saw the shock settle into him like cold rain. My God. I sat down hard at the kitchen table. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The coffee maker clicked on automatically at 5:30, just as it did every morning. The smell filled the room with a comforting familiarity that suddenly felt obscene. Ordinary life continuing while mine had just collapsed. Finally, Daniel sat beside me. Do you believe it? I stared at the polished wood grain of the table. I don't know what to believe. He reached for my hand. I let him take it, though my fingers felt numb. What are you going to do? I thought of Richard. He was still asleep at St. Joseph, probably unaware his entire lie was unraveling. The thought should have comforted me. Instead, it made me sick. I need proof, I said quietly. By 7 o'clock, I was climbing the narrow attic stairs in my childhood home. The house had belonged to my mother before Richard bought out her share after she died. He'd never changed much. Same floral wallpaper in the upstairs hallway, same antique brass fixtures, same faint scent of cedar and old books. The attic was exactly as I remembered. Dusty beams, cardboard boxes stacked with military precision, and in the far corner beneath the small dormer window sat the cedar chest. I hadn't opened it since I was 13. The brass latch resisted before finally giving way with a sharp metallic snap. Inside lay my mother's life. Folded sweaters, a silk scarf, old perfume bottles long dried empty, and beneath them, wrapped carefully in white linen, her Marine Corps dress blues. I froze. My mother had been a Marine. I had never known. Richard had told me she'd been a schoolteacher. Hands trembling, I unfolded the jacket. Captain's bars gleamed faintly beneath the dust. My breath caught. Captain Eleanor Reeves, not Harper. Reeves. The name struck me like a physical blow. Beneath the uniform lay her dog tags. And under those, letters. Dozens of them tied neatly with faded blue ribbon. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor and opened the first. The handwriting was firm and unmistakably military. My dearest Eleanor, if this deployment keeps me longer than expected, promise me you'll tell Abigail her father already loves her more than life itself. My vision blurred. I opened another. And another. Each signed the same way. Forever yours, Nathaniel? By the 4th letter I was openly shaking. Then I found the newspaper clipping. The Charleston Gazette, October 1994. Marine Major Nathaniel Reeves presumed killed in classified Beirut operation. A grainy photograph showed a younger version of the man who had pinned my promotion bars. The article explained his body had never been recovered. Presumed dead. I remembered what Richard had always told me. Your mother was widowed young. She never recovered from losing your father. A lie. All of it. Because if Nathaniel had been presumed dead, then Richard had entered her life afterward. He had not been my father abandoned by tragedy. He had been the man who stepped into tragedy and built a lie inside it. At the bottom of the chest sat one final envelope, unsealed. No stamp, no date. I opened it carefully. The handwriting was my mother's. If Abigail ever learns the truth, tell Nathaniel immediately. Richard cannot be trusted to do what is right. The room spun. I read it again. And again. My mother knew. She knew Richard would lie. And she had tried to leave a path back to the truth. A sound behind me made me jerk around. Daniel stood in the doorway, pale as ash. He must have read my face because he crossed the room without speaking and knelt beside me. I handed him the note. He read silently. Then he exhaled long and slow. Abby, she knew. My voice cracked. She knew what he'd do. Daniel sat beside me. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, he said gently, "There's more." I frowned. He handed me his phone. The screen showed a text message from an unknown number. Richard Harper requested immediate discharge from St. Joseph at 6:12 a.m., left against medical advice. My blood ran cold. He knows, Daniel said. I stood so fast the letters scattered across the floor. Number. Daniel rose with me. Abby. No, he doesn't get to run. For 28 years, Richard Harper had controlled every version of my life. He had shaped my childhood, buried my truth, and worn the title of father, while another man grieved a daughter he believed dead. And now that his lie had surfaced, he thought he could simply disappear. Number. I wiped my eyes and squared my shoulders with the reflexive precision of a Marine officer preparing for orders. For the first time in my life, I felt something colder than grief settle inside me. Resolve. Not revenge born of rage. Something cleaner. More exact. Truth. And Richard Harper was going to answer for every stolen year. Then Daniel's phone buzzed again. A second text. 3 words. He's gone home. I looked toward the attic window, toward the long oak-lined driveway below. And right then, through the morning fog, I saw Richard's black sedan pulling slowly into the drive. He had come back. And this time, I was waiting. Richard Harper stood in the center of my childhood living room as if nothing had happened. He wore pressed khakis and a pale blue button-down shirt, the kind he'd worn every Sunday for as long as I could remember. His silver hair was neatly combed. His expression was calm. Too calm. He looked exactly like the man who had raised me. That was what unsettled me most. How ordinary evil can look. When he saw me step into the room, his face softened into something almost fatherly. Abby, he said gently, "You're home early." I stared at him. For 28 years, I had looked into that face and seen certainty, stability, authority. Now all I could see was the architecture of deception. Daniel stood quietly behind me, saying nothing. Richard's eyes flicked briefly toward him, then back to me. "What's wrong?" I said nothing. I simply walked forward and placed my mother's note on the coffee table between us. The room went still. Richard looked down. I watched the exact moment recognition struck him. His face lost color. He didn't touch the note. Didn't pretend not to know what it was. He simply closed his eyes for one long second. And when he opened them, he looked 20 years older. "Where did you find that?" "In the attic," I said. My voice surprised me. It sounded calm, steady, Marine calm. The kind of calm that comes before action. He exhaled slowly and lowered himself into his leather chair. For a moment, he looked tired enough to tell the truth. Instead, he asked quietly, "Did Carter contact you?" The question itself was answer enough. I folded my arms. "Yes." Richard gave a bitter little laugh. I should have known Michael would lose his nerve eventually. The casualness of it made something twist inside me. "You paid him to hide my paternity test." His jaw tightened. "Yes." The single word hit harder than denial would have. No excuses. No shock. No performance. Just fact. Daniel shifted behind me, but I held up a hand. I wanted this. Needed this. Why? Richard looked at me, then really looked at me, and what I saw there unsettled me more than anger would have. Love. Broken, selfish, desperate love. Because I was afraid. I laughed sharply. Afraid? Yes. He rose slowly and walked to the window, staring out toward the old magnolia tree in the yard. "You were 2 years old when your mother died." The words landed like stones. My mother had never been discussed in detail. Richard always dismissed questions with the same answer. "It hurts too much." I'd stopped asking by 12. Now his voice was distant, almost reflective. Nathaniel was overseas again. Classified deployment. No contact. The military declared him missing. I said nothing. Richard's shoulders sagged. Eleanor believed he'd come home. She refused to let go. His voice broke slightly. "I loved her, Abigail. God help me, I loved her for years before she ever noticed me. The confession filled the room with something ugly and intimate. She was grieving, vulnerable. I told myself I was helping her, protecting both of you. His hands clenched behind his back. Then she became sick. A cold dread crept through me. What happened? He closed his eyes. Cancer. Aggressive. By the time they found it, there was nothing anyone could do. I felt my knees weaken. No one had ever told me that. Not once, Richard continued quietly. She made me promise to care for you if Nathaniel never returned. I swallowed hard. And when he did return, Richard turned toward me. The grief in his face looked real. That was the terrible part. I had already buried her, already held you through your nightmares, already become your father in every way that mattered. His voice roughened. And then Nathaniel came home alive. The room seemed to shrink. He came to Charleston asking questions, looking for Eleanor, looking for you. I could barely breathe. What did you tell him? Richard looked directly into my eyes. I told him you both died. The words struck like a rifle shot. For several seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. Then I heard myself whisper, "You let him believe his wife and daughter were dead." Richard's voice cracked. Yes. The honesty made it worse, because there was no defense in it. Only guilt. Only truth. My whole body trembled, but not from weakness. From the effort it took not to shatter. How could you? He stepped toward me. Instinctively, I stepped back. The pain on his face deepened. I loved you. No, I said quietly. My voice was steady now, steel wrapped in sorrow. You loved keeping me. He flinched. And in that moment, I knew I was right. Silence stretched between us. Finally, I asked the question that mattered most. Does he know? Richard looked confused. Nathaniel. His face tightened. Number. A lie. I saw it instantly. Marine training teaches you to read hesitation the way civilians read weather. His pupils narrowed. His breath caught. His shoulders locked. He was lying. I turned to Daniel. Get my car keys. Richard's composure broke. Abigail, don't. I met his eyes. Where is he? Please, where is he? He looked suddenly afraid. Then he whispered Paris Island. My heart stopped. He's there now. Richard nodded. He requested private leave this morning after Carter called him. Of course, someone had told him. For 28 years, General Nathaniel Reeves had believed his daughter was dead. And right now he knew otherwise. I turned for the door. Richard moved fast for a man his age, catching my arm. Abigail, listen to me. I looked down at his hand, then back at his face. The man who had raised me. The man who had lied to me every day of my life. For a brief, impossible second, I remembered being 6 years old with a skinned knee, him lifting me onto the kitchen counter while he bandaged it with careful hands. That memory hurt more than any lie, because part of him had loved me, and part of me had loved him back. Quietly, I removed his hand. Then I said the hardest words I had ever spoken. You don't get to stop this anymore. 2 hours later, I stood at Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Paris Island. And through the window of the commandant's private office, I saw him, General Nathaniel Reeves, standing in full dress blues, waiting for me. I had met generals before. In the Marine Corps, rank carries its own gravity. The room shifts when a general officer enters. Conversations sharpen, shoulders straighten. Time itself seems to move differently. But nothing prepared me for standing face to face with General Nathaniel Reeves and seeing my own eyes looking back at me. His office at Paris Island was spare and immaculate, exactly what I would have expected from a man whose reputation had become legend in the Corps. Framed commendations lined one wall. A model of the Eagle Globe and Anchor sat centered on a polished walnut shelf. Through the broad windows behind his desk, recruits could be seen crossing the parade deck in perfect formation under the South Carolina sun. He stood when I entered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He was taller than I'd imagined. Late 50s, broad-shouldered despite age, his silver hair cut close. The years had hardened his face into clean lines of discipline and endurance. But his eyes, those were my eyes, gray-blue, sharp and searching. And suddenly all the breath left my body. He took one careful step toward me as though approaching something fragile enough to break. Captain Harper. His voice was steady, but only just. I stood at attention, automatically, every Marine instinct rising to the surface. Sir? He gave the faintest shake of his head. At ease. I obeyed. He studied my face for what felt like forever. Then he whispered words so quiet I barely heard them. Eleanor's smile. And just like that, whatever professional composure I'd brought with me cracked. I looked away first. The room blurred slightly. He noticed. His voice gentled. You don't have to stand like a Marine right now. I swallowed hard. I don't know how else to stand. That drew the smallest smile from him, and for one impossible second I felt something shift between us. Recognition. Not certainty, but possibility. He gestured toward the chairs near the window. Please. I sat. He remained standing for a moment, gathering himself, then lowered into the chair opposite mine with deliberate control. The kind of control men learn when they've spent years carrying grief too heavy to set down. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he folded his hands and spoke plainly. I loved your mother more than I have ever loved anything in this life. The honesty in his voice was devastating. There was no performance in it. No manipulation. Only truth. I nodded for him to continue. He exhaled slowly. We met at Quantico. She was the finest logistics officer I'd ever seen. Smarter than me, which irritated me tremendously. A faint smile touched his mouth. She corrected a deployment routing error I'd missed in front of half the battalion, then apologized afterward because she thought she'd embarrassed me. Despite myself, I smiled. That sounded like someone I would have liked. She was brilliant, he said softly, and kind in ways this world rarely rewards. He looked down briefly. We married 6 months later. The words settled heavily between us. Not because they shocked me anymore, but because hearing them aloud made everything real. She became pregnant with you during my second overseas rotation. We were happy. His voice roughened. Then Beirut happened. I had read enough military history to know. The classified operation gone catastrophically wrong. Multiple casualties. Survivors extracted weeks later under secrecy orders. He had been one of them. I was listed missing. Communications were blacked out. For 37 days, no one outside command knew whether I was alive. His eyes met mine. When I came home, Richard met me at Eleanor's gravesite. My stomach clenched. He told me she'd died during childbirth complications, that the baby had died with her. I felt physically ill. The memory of Richard standing in our living room admitting it with such quiet certainty returned like acid. Nathaniel's voice dropped lower. I believed him. The pain in those 2 words filled the room. I could hardly breathe through it. I spent years trying to understand why God would let me survive war only to come home to that kind of loss. He looked toward the parade deck outside. I considered ending my career, nearly ended my life if I'm honest. I froze. He glanced back at me. Duty saved me, sometimes it's all that does. I understood that better than most. He leaned forward then and opened a folder on the table between us. Inside were photographs, my mother laughing beside him on a dock. Their wedding. Ultrasound scans. A grainy photo of Eleanor visibly pregnant smiling directly into the camera. My throat tightened. I touched the edge of one picture with trembling fingers. She kept all these. She mailed duplicates to my deployment address. His jaw flexed. They were returned unopened after I was declared missing. Richard signed for them. The room tilted again. Proof. Cold and absolute. No possibility of misunderstanding. Richard had intercepted everything. For nearly 30 years he had guarded this lie like treasure. And in that moment the shape of my revenge became clear. Not fury. Not destruction. Truth. Public undeniable truth. I looked up. What do you want from me? Nathaniel's expression changed instantly. Softened. Nothing. The word surprised me. He sat straighter. You owe me nothing, Abigail. Not trust. Not affection. Not forgiveness for years I couldn't be there. His voice faltered for the first time. I would settle for the chance to know the woman my daughter became. Something inside me broke open then. Not fully, but enough. I looked at this man, the stranger who was not a stranger at all, and saw none of Richard's possession. No claim. Only hope. And grief. And love patient enough to wait. That was when my phone rang. Daniel. I answered immediately. His voice was urgent. Abby, you need to come home. Ice slid through me. What happened? It's your father. A pause. Then, he emptied every account he had this morning. My pulse hammered. He's leaving. No, Daniel said grimly. He's not leaving. I heard voices in the background, papers shuffling. Then Daniel's next words stopped my heart. He's gathered the whole family at the house tonight. Why? Another pause. When Daniel answered, his voice was heavy with understanding. He knows the truth is out. I looked at Nathaniel. He was already rising to his feet, and in his eyes I saw exactly what I felt. After 28 years of lies, Richard Harper had finally decided to face judgment. By the time Nathaniel and I reached Charleston, dusk had settled over the city like a heavy curtain. The old Harper house stood lit from end to end, every downstairs window glowing gold against the darkening sky. Cars lined both sides of the oak-shaded street. My father's black sedan sat in the driveway like a silent accusation. He had invited everyone, aunts and uncles, cousins I saw only at holidays, family friends who had known me since childhood, people who had toasted my wedding only weeks earlier and still believed Richard Harper was the proud father of a successful Marine officer. He had gathered witnesses, not to escape, to confess. Nathaniel parked beside Daniel's car and shut off the engine. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence inside the vehicle was strange and intimate, filled with everything neither of us yet knew how to say. Finally, Nathaniel spoke. "Whatever happens tonight, Abigail, you set the terms." I looked at him. The dashboard light cut soft shadows across his face, revealing both strength and age. This man had commanded thousands, had survived combat loss and 30 years of grief. Yet he was handing control to me without hesitation. It was such a different kind of fatherhood from the one I'd known that it nearly undid me. I nodded once. Together we went inside. The house was silent when we entered. Every conversation stopped. Nearly 20 people stood gathered in the living room. My Aunt Carol's hand flew to her mouth when she saw Nathaniel beside me. Others simply stared. Richard stood near the fireplace, one hand braced against the mantel for support. He looked smaller somehow, older than he had that morning. His eyes found Nathaniel first, then me. And for the first time in my life I saw fear in Richard Harper. Not fear of punishment, fear of losing what he had stolen. Daniel stepped quietly to my side. His hand brushed mine once, steadying grounding. Then Richard spoke. His voice was low and formal. "Thank you all for coming." No one answered. He looked directly at the room. "There are things I have hidden for nearly 30 years. Tonight they end." He glanced toward me. I gave no reaction. Whatever happened next was his burden to carry. He drew a long breath. Then he told them everything. Not elegantly, not defensively. Plainly, he spoke of meeting Eleanor when Nathaniel was deployed, of loving her hopelessly, of caring for her through illness after Nathaniel was presumed dead, of learning she was dying, of the promise she made him swear to care for me if Nathaniel never returned. Then came the moment that changed him from caretaker to thief. When Nathaniel came home alive, Richard said quietly, "I couldn't bear to lose her all over again." The room remained perfectly still. His voice broke. So I lied. No one moved. No one interrupted. He described telling Nathaniel that Eleanor and I had died. Described intercepting letters. Destroying records. Paying doctors to bury DNA results when questions arose years later. Each word stripped him bare, and somehow hearing it all aloud hurt less than I expected. Because truth has a strange mercy. Once spoken, it stops poisoning the dark. When he finished, silence filled the room like prayer. Then Aunt Carol whispered what everyone was thinking. "How could you do something so monstrous?" Richard didn't answer. He simply lowered his head. Then, unexpectedly, he turned toward Nathaniel. The two men faced each other across 30 years of ruin. Richard's voice shook. "I stole your life." Nathaniel said nothing. Richard swallowed hard. "I told myself I loved her, loved Abigail, that keeping them was mercy." He looked at me then, and I saw no manipulation left in him. Only sorrow. But love built on theft isn't love at all. Tears burned my eyes. He had finally understood. Too late. But truly. Before anyone could speak, Richard staggered. His hand flew to his side. His face went gray. Then he collapsed. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Years of military crisis training took over. I dropped beside him, checking airway and pulse, while Daniel called commands to arriving paramedics. Richard's skin was cold and clammy, his breathing shallow. Dr. Carter met us at St. Joseph's emergency entrance. One look at Richard's labs and his face darkened. His kidneys are crashing, faster than expected. They rushed him upstairs. The family remained in stunned clusters throughout the waiting area. No one knew what to say. I sat beside Daniel in numb silence. Across from us, Nathaniel stood at the window looking out over Charleston Harbor, still straight-backed, still composed. But I could see his hands trembling faintly behind him. Dr. Carter returned an hour later. His expression was grave. "There's only one immediate donor match." The room seemed to hold its breath. Carter looked directly at Nathaniel. "General Reeves." The silence that followed felt endless. I stared at him. "Surely not. Not after everything. Not after 30 years stolen." Nathaniel absorbed the news without visible reaction. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "Will it save him?" Dr. Carter nodded. "With very strong odds." Nathaniel looked toward Richard's room. When he spoke, his voice was calm. "Prepare the operating room." I rose so quickly my chair scraped harshly against the floor. What? He turned to me. There was no anger in his face. No triumph. Only something deeper. Peace. You don't owe him this, I said. No, he agreed. I don't. Then why? For a moment his expression softened into something almost fatherly. Because it was fatherly. Because if I let bitterness decide this night, he said quietly, then Richard steals one more thing from both of us. My throat tightened. He stepped closer, and in front of our stunned family general, Nathaniel Reeves gently placed a hand on my shoulder. Abigail, revenge reveals character. His voice lowered. Tonight, let ours reveal honor. I broke then. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just silent tears finally released after 28 years of lies I had never known I carried. And for the first time in my life I leaned into my father. My real father, as orderlies wheeled him toward surgery to save the man who had stolen him from me. Richard Harper survived the surgery. The doctors told us later that if Nathaniel had waited even another hour to agree, Richard likely would have died before morning. I remember sitting in the recovery waiting room just before dawn, staring at the first pale streaks of sunlight spreading across Charleston Harbor beyond the hospital windows. It was one of those quiet southern mornings that always seem older than time itself, the kind where the world feels washed clean. For the first time in 30 hours, no one was speaking. Daniel sat beside me, his hand loosely wrapped around mine. Across from us, Nathaniel rested in a reclining chair, pale from anesthesia, but sitting upright anyway because men like him had spent a lifetime refusing to collapse in front of others. He caught me looking and gave me a faint smile. It was small, tired, real, and something inside me eased. Dr. Carter stepped into the room carrying 2 paper cups of hospital coffee and handed one to Nathaniel. You should be resting. Nathaniel accepted it with a slight nod. I've spent 30 years waiting to know my daughter. I can rest later. The words struck me harder than they should have. Not because they were dramatic, because they weren't. They were spoken with the plain certainty of truth. That was what made them powerful. I had spent most of my life around carefully managed emotions, love rationed out in practical gestures never spoken too plainly. Richard had believed affection became weaker when named aloud. Nathaniel seemed to believe the opposite. And I realized then how starved I had been for simple honesty. Richard woke late that afternoon. Dr. Carter allowed only immediate family inside. For the first time in my life, that phrase felt complicated. I entered first. He looked impossibly small against the white hospital sheets. The surgery had drained the color from his face. The force that had always defined him seemed diminished, as though truth itself had finally taken something from him. When his eyes opened and found mine, they filled instantly with tears. I had never seen Richard Harper cry. Not when my mother died. Not when I graduated boot camp. Not even when doctors told him his kidneys were failing. But now he wept openly. Abigail. His voice cracked on my name. I stepped closer but remained standing. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then he whispered why. I knew what he meant. Why had Nathaniel saved him? Why had Mercy answered theft? Before I could respond, the door opened behind me. Nathaniel entered slowly, one hand resting lightly against his side. Richard stared at him as though seeing judgment itself. Nathaniel stopped beside the bed, and then he said something I will carry for the rest of my life. You don't get to die before making this right. Richard broke. The sob that escaped him was raw and terrible, the sound of 30 years finally collapsing under their own weight. He covered his face with trembling hands. I'm sorry. Nathaniel said nothing. Richard looked at me then. Really looked at me. Not as possession. Not as proof of his sacrifice. Not as something he had earned. Simply as his daughter, the woman he had wronged. I thought loving you was enough, he whispered. His breathing hitched. I thought raising you gave me the right to keep the truth. He swallowed hard. I was wrong. The room was utterly still. Then he said the words I had needed all my life. I was proud of your uniform. Tears blurred my vision. He shook his head weakly. I mocked it because every medal you earned reminded me whose daughter you truly were. I could hardly breathe. All those years. All those cold dismissals. Not contempt. Shame. A man punishing himself by withholding the pride he could not bear to feel. And suddenly I understood something age teaches better than youth ever can. People do terrible things not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much and lack the courage to face it honestly. I stepped to the bedside. Richard looked up, frightened of what I might say. Quietly, I took his frail hand. You were the man who raised me. His breath caught. I looked back toward Nathaniel. And he was the man stolen from me. Then I faced Richard again. Both things are true. His mouth trembled. Can you ever forgive me? I thought of the answer carefully. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not excusing. It is simply choosing not to live forever inside another person's sin. At last I nodded. Yes. He closed his eyes and wept. Not with relief. With gratitude. The honest kind. 6 months later, I stood on the parade field at Camp Lejeune beneath a bright Carolina sky as my promotion ceremony began. Rows of Marines stood sharp in dress blues. Families filled the bleachers. The brass band played softly in the distance. When my name was called, I stepped forward. Major Abigail Reeves Harper. The name had taken time to choose, and healing to deserve. Nathaniel stood on my right in full dress blues. Richard stood on my left, still thinner from recovery, but stronger every week. Together they pinned the gold oak leaves of Major to my collar. One father by blood, one by years, both changed by truth. As the applause rose around us, Nathaniel saluted first. Richard followed awkwardly, having practiced for weeks just to do it properly. I returned both salutes with tears in my eyes. And in that moment, standing between the men who had shaped my life through love and failure alike, I understood the lesson this story was always meant to teach. Secrets may shape a life for a season, but truth, however painful, sets it free. If this story has ever reminded you of someone you need to forgive, or someone who deserves your honesty before time runs out, don't wait. Life humbles all of us eventually. The brave thing is telling the truth before it has to break us open. And if this story moved, you share it with someone who may need that reminder too. And stay with us for more stories about family truth and the quiet courage it takes to come home.